So welcome everybody. This is a series on types of forced migration. It's a very confusing system. The US and international migration system has a lot of factors to it. And the different ways that we see migrants coming to the United States, of course, have been large this year, from Afghanistan to Ukraine, to everything that's happening currently at the southern border. And all of these are different types of visas and different types of events that led to the determination of what kind of visas are used for folks to get into the United States. This series is meant to help you discern for your immigration working group or your church or your conference about which type of visas you are able to serve, if any, and why, based on the context of where you're at, what capacity and resources you have, and where you're physically located. Also, it might just be handy information to know why, for example, the Afghanistan response looked different than the Ukraine response, looks different than the southern border response, which looks different than the Haiti response, which looks different than the Horn of Africa response. Why do they all look different? So this is meant to answer some of those questions. And I am going to make a huge attempt to allow for question and answer at the end. This is going to be the most information heavy session. I apologize for that. This is going to be a lot of information. You might feel a little overwhelmed. I'm going to name for you the parts that are going to be revisited in future sessions afterward, because each session after in the following Wednesdays are going to be targeting one topic instead of a general overview as this one is. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share a PowerPoint presentation that will hopefully help make the make this easier. Remember how to do it. Share screen. A little rusty. I've been mostly using Teams recently. Okay, there we are. Okay, so as I said, this whole series is called Types of Forced Migration, How the Church Can Respond. If you determine that you or your church or your conference are not able or not at capacity to respond, there are different ways of supporting, and having knowledge is power to know how you can support different church groups, different organizations that do have capacity to respond. So this is a general overview of the international migration system. And again, why all of these refugee crises, which there has been a lot that happened this year, look so different. So the International Refugee Resettlement System was born in 1951. That's UNHCR, which is the United Nations Higher Commission on Refugees. Of course, after World War II, the United Nations in general was born as a response to not wanting to see the mistakes of World War II happen again. So there was a very specific way in which a refugee, and a refugee is just defined as a person that had to flee their country due to political, religious, or cultural identity and persecution. What makes a person a refugee is only based on if they have what's called a credible threat. And that's refugees, asylum seekers, any type of person who is forced to migrate. So that means a person that is leaving because of religious, political, gender identity, any sort of persecution about their personal identity or their cultural identity. And they were threatened by their life for having that identity. That's the only reason that makes them a refugee. And so that's vetted for every single person that enters the refugee resettlement system, whether in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So when UNHCR was born in 1951, really the only qualifier that they had was this, that you're gonna die if you stay in your home country because of who you are. And that is the sole basis of what creates a refugee, according to UNHCR. And that continues to be true, like what, 70 years later? Which is problematic in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about that. This was sort of based on the Jewish folks that were the thought process of what creates a refugee, who a refugee is, was based solely on that one population, which made sense at the time. But of course, we have multiple kinds of refugee crises forced migration crises that have happened since then that don't look exactly or even very close at all to what happened to the Jewish people in Europe in the 1940s. So, because it's vague and it's small and it's particular, it's very easy to manipulate because most of the refugee crises, or I should say forced migration crises, because a refugee is a very specific category of forced migration. These refugee crises are easy to manipulate because the categorization is so narrow. So we see a lot of the chaos that happens in the refugee system and why Afghanistan looks different than Ukraine, looks different than Syria, simply because countries are able to pick and choose based on not having very much guidelines to go by. So they can make up their own for the most part. You know, there's been talks over the years among the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, between countries about how to change the refugee resettlement system to match what we're seeing. For example, having some sort of identifier for people that were forced to flee because of climate change, or identifier for people that were forced to flee because there is no work in their country, or because of a drought, or because they have family somewhere else. Because since the 1940s, it's become a lot more common for your family to live way farther away from you than it used to, with the ability to travel and connect virtually all the time. Look, we're doing it right now. This wasn't an ability in the 1940s. There's a lot of reasons why people migrate now that just weren't true 50 years ago. And countries have tried to sort out a different way to practice how we agree on what a refugee is differently, and it's had very little results. So we still see this model in which it's narrowly defined to match what the Jewish people went through in Europe in the 1940s, and hasn't developed much since then. This creates extreme vulnerability for all these populations that are forced to migrate for reasons that are beyond this very narrow definition of persecuted for religious, cultural, gender, ethnic identity. And that makes them targets very easily, because when they are forced to migrate and they're not let into a host country, they become very vulnerable to things like gangs or human trafficking. We see a lot of that happening at the southern border right now because of a lot of the policies that have been implemented by the US government out of an abundance of ability to make up laws in the absence of having an international system that that defines who gets to survive fleeing their country. Right now, we're at a record high of over 100 million people displaced. A lot of that is because of the massive uptick of Ukrainians who were forcibly displaced recently. But that's the highest per capita it's ever been in the history of the world, and that is not good. So this is a conversation we really need to be having. It would be a good advocacy model for the church to bring into conversation with partners, governmental and nonprofit partners, about what we can do to make a more robust refugee resettlement system, so that countries like the United States and Europe, which are typically third-party countries that people go to, are able to actually welcome with dignity and equity instead of making up their own laws. So that is a big system, right? And it'd be very hard for just us in the United Church of Christ to change it, although our voice does matter. And I do encourage you to discern ways that you can advocate for those changes to happen. I'm happy to be in conversation with you if that is your passion and your calling, is to advocate for changes to the international system. But what I would like to switch to talking about is the types of immigrants that you could host as an individual church, as a conference, as even just you yourself, if your family wanted to sponsor a family of forced migrants. So the most common one that we hear about is refugee, right? Is that a refugee is the person that's forced to flee. So a refugee is actually really high up in the model of types of forced migration. I'm just going to jump over to this slide real quick. So a refugee has already gone through the asylum seeker process, and I will again come back to this document later. But so every person that is a technical refugee has at one point been an asylum seeker. And everyone that's been an asylum seeker gained that status from being just a person that approached a border. And maybe they approached the border with a humanitarian parole, or maybe they approached the border with nothing. Anyway, there's tiers, and refugee is really the highest tier you could get of eligibility for services by being a forced migrant. So a refugee, which we will cover more in week 2, is really the easiest type of migrant to host of a forced migrant. And again, a forced migrant is a person that had to leave their country. The narrow definition being because of identity persecution, but a more broad definition would be that maybe there wasn't any work there, maybe there was climate change that caused them to be displaced, maybe family conflict, maybe gang rivalry, or maybe there was a corrupt government. None of these are considered reasons for forced migration according to the US government, unfortunately. The only one is identity persecution. So every refugee has been able to, technical refugee has been able to prove that they had identity persecution that made them forced to flee their country. And that is a very high tier for them to have gotten to. And they've been through tons of processing by the time that they get to the United States or a different third-party country in Europe, the UK, Australia, elsewhere that typically hosts refugees. They're the easiest to host because they have the most amount of services available to them. They have the most security of being able to stay in their third-party country. They've already been vetted for years, sometimes up to 20, 30 years they've been processed to make sure that they qualify for this refugee status. And so when they get to the refugee office and wherever they're going, that means that they get benefits such as food stamps, cash assistance, case management, employment assistance, housing. They get all these things because they've been through a very thorough, long vetting process based on this one identity persecution marker. But it makes us as the church easy to meet the refugee office and say, I would like to host one of them. So we'll go over that more next week about what it looks like to host a refugee family, which again, in the arena of forced migration, is the easiest type of migrant to host. Now, what we really need more of in the United Church of Christ, and that I hope you all come to week 4, is asylum accompaniment churches. It is much harder. I'm just being frank with you so that you know what you're getting into if you decide to do this, but you will get support, and there are other churches and there's good, smart people who know how to do this process, but we need asylum accompaniment churches. So an asylum seeker is a person that has most likely come through the southern border, but not always, but they approached a border, again, we're talking about the United States because all of us are in the United States, but this is pretty much true worldwide. As an asylum seeker approaches the border and says that they can meet the identity markers of a refugee if they only got the opportunity to. So they claim that they can prove that they have identity persecution, that they're going to be directly killed, not their friend, but them are going to be killed, and they can prove it if they stay in their country of origin. And so they are. It used to be, for most of United States history, that they were allowed to stay on U.S. soil. They don't get any sort of help or benefits or employment eligibility or anything, but they're allowed to stay while a court processes them to decide whether or not they actually do fit the markers of a refugee. And then they have to claim that asylum, which is a visa process called an I-589. And then after they've claimed asylum, then they can apply for the I-94, which is a refugee, and that's when they get the benefits. It takes like years to get through that. So an asylum seeker comes with nothing. They could very easily get deported if a court or a judge decides that their credible threat claim is not eligible for refugee status, which happens a lot. And while they're waiting for that, there's a lot of anxiety, and also they don't have any way of supporting themselves. So that's a lot more work to take care of an asylum seeker. But there's been recent changes, big changes happening in the border policies, in particular, the Supreme Court overturning the migrant protection protocols, which instead of allowing people to seek asylum in the United States and await their court processing in the United States, they were being expelled to Mexico. Over, I think, 80,000 people have been expelled to Mexico over the last 3 years to await asylum into the United States under a Trump era policy that was declared unconstitutional last week, which the United Church of Christ put out a statement agreeing with the decision of the Supreme Court and celebrating what that could look like. They are still being expelled to Mexico because the Supreme Court said, we don't think it's constitutional, but also we don't have an idea of how to make it possible for them to stay in the United States. Because what happens to asylum seekers is often they go to immigration detention. Immigration detention is overwhelmed, inhumane, and so they just don't have anywhere to put all these folks. There's approximately 8,000 people that approach the border every day. Most of them are currently turned away under something called Title 42, which is a public health policy, again, under the Trump administration, that was placed because of COVID-19, although clearly, and it has been clarified more recently, that it's more just because the border is overwhelmed and we don't have anywhere to put all these asylum seekers. The only type of asylum seeker that is currently let through is, if you'll jump down in that list I have there, is the unaccompanied children. So we have seen about a 200% increase of people just leaving their kids at the border, because if anyone is going to survive having to flee their country, they want to make sure their children do. So they make the worst decision a human being could ever make, and they leave their children so they know that they're going to be able to get through, and they go back to possibly die wherever they came from. This is the sad reality of what's happening, not only at our southern border, but at borders all over the world, as the immigration system in general becomes overwhelmed with not knowing how to deal with the huge uptick in forced migration. Again, it's over 100 million. So a lot of these policies that are securitization policies that force asylum seekers away and minimize the amount of people that actually do qualify for asylum and then eventually refugee status, is for the protection of third-party countries. And again, there's no statements anywhere that has been agreed on about what this should look like. I have done my own research on what it could look like that I'm happy to share with you, about a way that host countries could be more responsible about the constitutional right to asylum while also not having an overwhelmed system. But as of right now, our policies, not just the United States, but most of Europe, just expel asylum seekers and expect them to go figure it out or die. So again, the only type that's allowed through under Title 42 is unaccompanied children, with some other exceptions due to health or extreme circumstances. All the same, even though we're not seeing as many asylum seekers coming through just because they're getting expelled into Mexico, where they are being greeted with gang violence and other types of extreme atrocities. I'm sure many of you read about in the news a week or two ago, 46 migrants that died of heat stroke in an abandoned truck. That is very typical of the way that these asylum policies create extreme danger for migrants. And also, what does it tell you? That migrants are still seeking safety at risk of that sort of thing happening. Anyway, that's going to be week 4. I think week 4 is going to be a really important one for everyone to come to, or at least watch later if you're unable to come live. Because what we really need is more churches that are willing to step in and help create a network for asylum seekers if and when they are able to get through the border. Because the migrant protection protocols was overturned and declared unconstitutional, we're hoping that we see the Biden administration allow more types of asylum seekers to come through the border. And that means we need more support, because ICE detention is the only other avenue, really, besides the shelters. Shelters and ICE detention, they're all overwhelmed. but churches can support and churches can host asylum seekers, and we are happy. I'll probably have Noel Anderson on for that, maybe Randy Mayer too, and we'll go over what that could look like, what it does look like when churches do that, and how you'll get as much support as can possibly be given should you choose to become an asylum accompaniment church. On week 3, we'll go over humanitarian parole, which has never been a very big used designation. Most of the Afghans that came over in late August of last year were on humanitarian parole simply because the United States didn't know what else to do with tens of thousands of Afghan nationals who had suddenly jumped on planes after the Taliban takeover. It was poorly done, the whole process. So they just put them onto humanitarian parole, and now we have loads of them. Humanitarian parole needs to next apply for asylum, which again is a very long court process that takes years. And then if they are approved for asylum, then they have to apply for refugee status. Again, a process that takes years. And then if they get refugee status, then they need to apply for citizenship eventually, because a refugee can eventually become a citizen. So this is like 5, 10, 15-year process for folks to go from being in danger of dying to finally finding all the services and safety that they need. So a lot of churches that are hosting Afghan families right now are trying to figure out how to transfer their status from I-131 humanitarian parole to I-589 asylum seeker, and then eventually I-94 refugee. So I'll just go briefly over COFA, which is, we're not going to cover that one again unless you have questions about it. That is a very small designation of forced migrant, and that's pretty much only specific to the Pacific Islands. So a COFA migrant is if someone's on here that can tell me what it stands for, I always forget. Compact of Force. Sorry, I don't remember what it stands for. But it's basically Micronesian populations that the U.S. government said, I'm sorry for blowing up your islands in the 50s, because the United States used the Micronesian islands in the 1950s as testing sites for nuclear bombs, which created terrible climate issues and poverty. And so they handed out these COFA migrant packages to folks as an, I'm sorry for blowing up your islands. You're allowed to go work in the United States. That's all they get. They just get a work visa to be able to work in the United States. Nothing else. So you see a lot of COFA migrants in Hawaii in particular because it's Pacific Island. That's also a type of forced migration. COFA can never apply for an adjustment status as far as I know. But so I can offer more on that, but that's a very limited designation of forced migration. Internally displaced and stateless, most people that are in forced migration right now, most of them are actually internally displaced. Only 1% of people that are displaced and forced to migrate right now qualify as a refugee. Most people have just fled into caves, into a province of Afghanistan or Syria or Kenya, wherever they are, Haiti, and so they just aren't at home. They're just wandering around trying to figure out where they're going to be able to go. So that is actually the most common type of forced migrant, is one that has not actually left their home country or has stayed in a refugee camp in a nearby country, and they just kind of don't have any status at all. They're just waiting to see if they can ever go home or if they can ever change their status adjustment to asylum seeker or refugee. That's most forced displacement worldwide. Also stateless. Palestine is a good example of stateless, is that Palestinian refugees from 1948 who did not take the deal from the West Bank, but instead were forced into Gaza, will forever not have any sort of documentation declaring them as a legal human being. There are a lot of situations in the world like this in which there has been terrible upheaval in some country that caused people to not have any paperwork whatsoever. And so they are just stateless and unable to move through any systems because of being stateless. Again, internally displaced and stateless is the most common type of forced migrant. Now, we can't host people that are internally displaced and stateless. But we can, and we do, send money into international situations that do support people that are in these terrible situations. So if you have questions about how to donate to those funds, I would be happy to connect you with the appeals and also the grants that we have distributed to make sure that people that are in that situation get the help that they need. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're mostly going to be talking about refugees, asylum seekers, and humanitarian parole. I missed DACA. So DACA goes under the asylum seeker category, in which DACA means kids that were taken into the United States by their parents who may have applied for asylum and had it denied and became undocumented immigrants. So undocumented immigrant means a person that applied for asylum, didn't receive it, and now they are illegal, or rather undocumented, because just because a judge says that you don't fit this narrow meaning of persecution doesn't mean that you can just go home. So DACA means it's their kids, and they've grown up in the United States, they don't know another home. And so the Supreme Court is actually deciding this week, is it legal for them to stay here? Because that would be terrible to make a child who was 2 or 3 years old when their parents immigrated to the United States go back to a country in Central America or elsewhere where they don't know anyone, they don't know the language. So that's the problem with DACA. Also, again, undocumented migrant, that'll be covered more extensively in week 4. That's part of the asylum seeker package. The way that we meet that as a church is called Sanctuary Church, and we'll go over that in week 4. Not included in these types are spousal migrant, work migrant. So that's the golden ticket to being able to immigrate legally into the United States, is if you get a fancy job that will pay for your work visa, that will pay for your green card. There are a lot of companies that do that: Google, Amazon, the Cleveland Clinic. There's a lot of countries that do want overseas workers and will pay for them, but it's rare. You have to be really good at your subject to be able to get that kind of visa. Or spousal, you can marry an American. When people ask me how to immigrate to America, sometimes I say your best bet is to find an American wife. J1, F1, and R1, those are all temporary visas. We as the church can also host those. That's just folks that come over that want to offer a skill, learn something new, be a summer camp counselor. It's temporary for them to provide a skill, like maybe go lecture for some classes at a university, be a summer camp counselor, take some English classes from a university. An F1 visa is an international student visa. R1 is a religious worker visa, so you come over to do some work with the church. But all those are only months long, and then you have to go back. They're not eligible for permanency in any regard. But of course, there's tourists. We all know what a tourist is. But so we're not going to be talking about any of those either. That's not forced migration, it's voluntary migration, according to the US government. So I already went over this a little bit. This is sort of the process of what it looks like. I will send this this image in an email to all of you. This is from Human Rights First. But basically, asylum seekers have to claim that they're going to die if they don't stay in their home, or if they stay in their home country, and then they go through this big contrived system to either become a refugee or get deported. And that's basically how it goes. And if they are determined to be deported, that's when they become undocumented. And undocumented immigrants, that's another level in which, as I said, the church can serve in Sanctuary Church. We have churches that do provide sanctuary, because ICE cannot. Well, it's on the fence. It's undefined whether or not ICE can go into a church and physically remove someone to send them on a plane back to Haiti or wherever they think they should be going. It doesn't look very good for ICE to be doing that, walking into a church and forcibly removing people. So often they don't. But again, there's just not very many guidelines about how all this works. So we've kind of made them up over time. But we'll talk more about that week 4. Come back for week 4. Okay, so what's the difference between Ukraine, Afghanistan, the southern border, Syria? These are all recent forced migration crises that have happened. The Ukraine being a big one. So a lot of the reason why you haven't heard very much from me about that is because it's about location. So when people are forced to flee, they tend to go into the neighboring country, which is why we see a lot of folks from Central America coming into the United States, because it's very typical for an asylum seeker, a person that's being forced to migrate, to go into the country next door, right? Just because of physical location. So Central America is actually not the most amount of places that we see forced migration coming from, except for Venezuela. Venezuela is on the top of places that people are forced to migrate from, but the rest of Central American countries, not so much. Places where people are most likely to have to flee from are Afghanistan, Syria, the Horn of Africa, Myanmar, and Venezuela. But we just see a lot of the southern border because of its location. We're not seeing a lot of Ukraine because of its location. Europe's in a huge refugee crisis, but we aren't seeing a lot of it here just because we're not there. We are supporting what's happening in Ukraine and our partners over there, and making sure that we are sending, as the United Church of Christ, sending what we can. And we are probably going to get Ukrainians who will be processed in on refugee visas in 1 to 2 years. We already have had a couple come up through humanitarian parole through the border that UCC churches are sponsoring. But basically, the reason why Ukraine didn't look like Afghanistan is because most Ukrainians are being processed into Europe. It's also considered a temporary situation. Everyone is thinking that Ukrainians will go back to their country once they're able to. Is that true? I don't know. We'll see. Having aid from the United Church of Christ and other organizations to help rebuild will be crucial for them to be able to go home, absolutely. But it's perceived as temporary. Also, another issue to consider about Ukraine is simply racism. So, as I said, there is no actual way in which there's supposed to be a refugee resettlement process that is defined internationally. So, the United States government decided that most Ukrainians are eligible for asylum once they approach the southern border. Again, no one right now is getting asylum except for unaccompanied children, people that are very ill, except for Ukrainians. So if a Ukrainian goes to the southern border and claims that they want humanitarian parole, which again gets them immediately into the United States, we'll cover more of that in week 3, then I know it's complicated. I feel like I'm throwing a lot of information at you. I'll be narrowing this down in the coming weeks. But so if a Ukrainian approaches the southern border and claims humanitarian parole, they will technically be allowed in. No other ethnicity is being allowed that. And there's no reason for that other than just simply racism. Syria, same thing. I'm just going to jump to Syria. When we compare it with Ukraine, that's perceived permanent because not nearly as much money went into Syria during the height of its conflict to be able to rebuild Syria. So it's perceived that Syrians will forever be displaced into different countries. Which we do get Syrians processed in the United States under refugee resettlement, probably about the same amount as we're going to get from Ukraine. However, like I said, the difference is that Syrians are being processed for refugee resettlement in a third-party country because it's perceived permanent. Ukraine, we're expecting they're going to go home because the world is providing enough aid to Ukraine for them to be able to go home. There wasn't enough aid provided to Syria for the same thing to happen. Also, just racism. When Syrians were trying to get across the Mediterranean Sea and crossing borders to get to Europe, they were met with no and turned back around. We don't see the same thing happening with Ukraine, and there's no logical reason for that to have happened other than racism. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But Ukraine and Syria are a really good comparison in that they're kind of the same sort of situation. Ukraine was sort of more sudden than Syria was. Syria was sort of a slow meltdown. But basically, if Syria would have gotten the same sort of support that Ukraine has, it might have looked a lot different. But also, we can't talk too much and woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? All we have is now. And Ukrainians deserve just as much love and support as Syrians, as much as Haitians, as much as Afghans. So Afghanistan, Uh, so the reason why we shipped all these folks over on humanitarian parole, which again is almost a never used designation that is very widely used as of this year, is because it was basically an informal apology from the US government. Whoops, we messed up the last 20 years, clearly. Everyone get on a plane. We don't have a way of processing you because we hadn't started processing any of you. So they just shipped all them over and said, let's see what we can do. And that's why we saw, that was the craziest rush that has happened in the history of refugee resettlement in the United States, is watching 80,000 people suddenly come over without any or very little to no processing on this very underused designation, and having to transfer their designation, put them in military bases. And the church stepped up. The United Church of Christ stepped up. We resettled approximately 1,000 Afghans in the last 9 months, and that's awesome. But that's why that looked different than Ukraine or Syria, is that they couldn't just flee into second party countries. Pakistan wasn't going to take them. Neither was Iran. They were not going to take them. And the United States felt responsible for Afghanistan, so we took them all, which again, there are no rules. They could just do that, right? They could technically do that with any population. Do we owe an apology to Guatemala? Yeah. Do we owe an apology to Haiti? Most definitely. Are we going to do the same thing with those countries as we just did to Afghanistan last year? Nope. So it's all up in the air, but that's what happened, right? So the southern border, we went over that a little bit. The only reason why that is such a big deal to the United States is because it's our next door neighbors, not because that is the biggest forced migration crisis in the world. Not that it is insignificant. But that it's right next door. And these restrictive border policies that pick and choose who can come in and why are a lot of the reasons why almost none of them are being allowed through. So as you see, the common denominator with all of these examples is that the refugee resettlement system basically picks and chooses who they want to come through. And technically, the only real designation that the United Nations agreed on is, are you forced to flee? Are you going to die if you stay in your home country because of who you are? And that can be just way up for debate, way up for manipulation. So I know it's a lot, but that's basically what we see in all these different countries. Can we change it? I don't know. But what we can do, what I definitely know we can do, is we can do our best to understand these systems, their visas, and how we can host them. So who should I host? My three big factors in how to determine who you should host is location, capacity, and discernment. The churches that have been most successful at hosting refugees, asylum seekers, humanitarian parolees, or other have been churches that have done a lot of internal discernment work. If your church is in conflict with itself and disagreement about what your calling and your passion and your capacity is, then it's important to know more about what the root is of that conflict and being present with each other than it is to take on a vulnerable population. And that's true of vulnerable populations of any kind, you know, homeless folks, battered women, all sorts of vulnerable populations. If your church, if yourself aren't centered in knowing what you have to offer and who you are, then you have the possibility of making the situation with the vulnerable person worse. That's chaplaincy 101. All chaplains are trained to have better self-understanding, reflective power, centering ability and knowledge, so that when we meet a person who is in a super vulnerable situation, we can meet it without bringing our conflict into theirs. So I see a lot of times there's churches that have internal conflict about how they're going to go about it, and they create conflict with the refugee family or the refugee office they're working with by not being internally centered with each other first. So I want to start with discernment, and then I think that's hugely important for churches to know thyself so that you can know the other, right? Which is a lot of what we do as churches, right? That's what we do every Sunday morning, is we learn more about ourselves, the other, and God. So we're a very good place to do that, more so than different kinds of agencies. So capacity, you know, knowing where you are contextually, and that's something I can work with your individual church or conference on, is what you guys have to offer out there. How much time can you commit? What's your financial dedication? If you're going to apply for grants, where are you going to get those from? Do you have available housing? Do you have available housing? If you have a house or a parsonage that's available for hosting, that is the most valuable thing that you can offer a refugee office is available housing, because the United States is in a housing crisis. Also available jobs. But yeah, for almost every type of migrant that you could host, having a place for them to stay is important. Whether you're doing a respite center and you're just using your sanctuary, as long as there's, if it's temporary housing and you're just helping an asylum seeker get to where they need to go, or you're helping a humanitarian parolee get to their final location. If you're just offering them your church sanctuary and you install, a shower and a small kitchen off the side, that should be fine. But if it's meant to be permanent housing, it should be more like a parsonage, and that's more for refugee resettlement. Although sanctuary, church, or asylum accompaniment can take a long time. Again, we'll go over these in future weeks. Also, if you are in California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, those are prime places that we need churches to help support our churches there that are already actively working and create a network to help welcome the shelters that are at the border, which are getting just thousands of people coming through every day, even with the restrictions. If you live within 50 miles of a refugee office, you could co-sponsor a refugee. That is not necessarily final. Just this year, because of the Afghan crisis, they expanded that radius, but refugee offices often prefer that you're within 50 miles so they can get case managers and other necessities to the refugee family. Also, if you're within 50 miles of a refugee office, it probably means you're more likely to be within the radius of the refugee or asylum seekers families culture, just refugee family, their cultural centers and the things that they need to feel at home and integrate well. And then, do I have support other churches that I'm working with? It's always good and valuable to work with other churches in your area or other interfaith organizations to know what professional services you have around. So again, location, capacity, and discernment. Know what's around you, know what you have to offer and what you don't, and then make sure that your church group are solid enough with each other to be solid with another person who is in a vulnerable situation. So this is just a trauma-informed care wheel about what that looks like. So, and that's a lot of what I've been talking about already, is that a lot of what people in these situations that have been through terrible trauma really need is to feel heard, like they have a voice, like they have autonomy in what they're doing. And the best way to be able to give someone autonomy and the ability to grow is, again, to be solid with yourself and to be able to be clear with who you are so you can most accurately listen to the other person without imposing what you want or what you're thinking onto what they want and what they're thinking. It's easier to hear another person clearly when you can hear yourself clearly. I can't emphasize that enough, which is why we're the church, right? It's one of the reasons, it's one of the great things about being the church is that we have the tools to do just that, I would hope. So if you're going to sponsor a refugee, these are the 3 different ways to do it. Again, we'll go over this in week 2 over refugees. Again, refugee is the easiest type of forced migrant to host because they've already been through a million tiers of vetting that allows them to have the most amount of services. So I will bring this one back up next week if you decide that you want to connect with local refugee offices and support a refugee family. To host an asylum seeker family, which again, we need way more of in the UCC. There's different ways to do that. They don't receive any outside support, none. Their kids are allowed to go to local schools. That's about it. But so we are in conversation with FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security about possibly creating respite centers for migrants to move away from the southern border so that the southern border doesn't get more overwhelmed than it is. So churches can be those places, right? Because a church can host an asylum seeker family for a night or 2 while they're in transit to Seattle or Miami or New York or wherever it is that their final destination is. Asylum seekers often come to the United States because they know someone in the country that they're going to go live with, but they need help getting there, transportation and a place to stay, warm meal. So that's what a respite center could be. And I could talk to you about what that would look like if your church became a respite center, where you had rotating asylum seekers coming through with support from governmental organizations. Uh, Also, asylum accompaniment. That's what we really need, is asylum accompaniment. And that just means that you host an asylum seeker family in the same way that you'd host a refugee family, but it'd be a lot more expensive and difficult because they're not going to have any services. They don't know how long they're going to be in flux. But basically, it's hosting them and taking care of all their needs while they process into getting their I-94 refugee status. And we have a lot of churches that do that, and a lot of churches that can support you in being part of that network. I've copied in here the UCC's asylum accompaniment kit that, again, we'll go over in week 4. Or Sanctuary Church is another way that you could sponsor asylum seekers. Once an asylum seeker has been told, no, you don't match the criteria for credible threat, then they become undocumented, and that may happen after years and years. And they already have a job, and they've created a family, and this is their home now. So Sanctuary Church helps have a place for an asylum seeker family to stay after they've been denied, while they appeal to a different judge in a different court to have a stay of asylum. And the church can advocate for that to happen too. And so I've also put a link there. Again, we'll go more over that in week 4 about ways that you can advocate for an undocumented family to become documented, because a judge's decision, again, is not based on very many guidelines. If they just decide they don't like the asylum seeker, they can turn them away. It's not as simple as refugee resettlement. Refugee resettlement is way more simple. We have hundreds of churches in the UCC that are sponsoring refugees right now. Awesome. But we have only a small handful that are doing asylum accompaniment. Understandably so. But this is my big ask to all of you, is to consider ways that you can coordinate with, discern with your church and coordinate with other churches to be able to help with this need that may be a growing need as MPP was overturned recently, and perhaps we're going to see major changes happening at the border. So as usual, you can expect information like this from us at Refugee and Migration Services, and then connection to local partnerships and other churches that can support you and help you. We have grants available for qualifying churches. We can also put you into our partner and service program so that you are on our radar for support, to make sure, because as I said, there's hundreds of churches that do this, but if you enter in the partner and service program, you'll be more visible to us so that we can be in direct communication with you about what your needs are and helping you find what the best things are for you to get. We have several refugee partner and service churches right now. And then updated information about changes in migration policies. The biggest update I have right now is that the next refugee crisis is likely going to come out of the Horn of Africa, where a lot of people have been processing into the refugee system for years and years. There's currently a drought there that's causing major famine. So it's possible that the refugee resettlement system is going to start kicking a lot more refugees actually into third countries instead of leaving them in limbo. So we may see a huge uptick in folks from Somalia, Eritrea, Kenya, Ethiopia, and other parts of the Horn of Africa, Sudan, in the coming months as their refugee status is finalized in order to get them out of a growing crisis of gang conflict, warfare, and famine. So just an update on what the map of worldwide refugee crisis is looking like. That's probably going to be the next big one. And maybe at the beginning of next year, I was thinking of actually putting together an international map that we could interactively look at so that we can see where all of these crises are happening and learn more about them and the people and where they're coming from, so that we can welcome them with better knowledge and empowerment by knowing more about them. So that was a lot of information. So I'm going to stop sharing and let you guys go ahead and buttons and ask questions. And yeah, thanks for sticking through that. Okay, so floor is yours.
Are you open for questions now? Okay, So we have Afghan refugees on parole, and I didn't realize that it was a two-step process, that first they have to apply for asylum and then they have to apply for refugee status. If that's the case, what is the difference in the criteria for those two different kinds of status?
That's a great question. So again, Afghanistan's a really unusual situation in which all these folks that are on humanitarian parole are actually qualified for the same benefits as refugees. So they're already sort of like refugees already. And they're the only population in the history of ever that's sort of gotten refugee status as humanitarian parolees. So you'd have to more accurately ask your local refugee office about how that process is going to look. But basically, the first step is to apply them for asylum, the I-589, which gives them some sort of permanency. But because they already have the benefits of a refugee without being a refugee, I'm not sure what it's going to look like, to be honest, when they transfer from I-589 into I-94. That's the general process. That's the normal one. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer for that.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Yes. My church here in Eau Claire is sponsoring a asylum seeking family that have been here just over a year. And my question is wondering when we've had some mixed information on when this man who is just eager to work is allowed to work. So do you have any information on, when a work permit or the permission to work is allowed?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not until he gets his I-94 and becomes a refugee. They've already gotten their I-589, their asylum seeker status.
Yes.
So the next step is to get in contact with your local refugee office and have their status transferred to I-94, probably.
Okay.
An asylum seeker is not allowed to work.
Yes. Okay. I'm assuming that piece has been done and there's still a waiting time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Irene, would you talk a little bit about the grants, the process, the timeline, what kind of things they can be used for?
Sure. So right now I have 2 grants through UCC National that are available. One is called the Afghan Resettlement Grant, just because most of our churches up till now have been hosting Afghans since my inception in this position, which was August. But I'm planning on making a more general one for other types of migrants. But the resettlement one is basically for churches to get funding to help with the resettlement process, because the resettlement process is expensive for refugees. So if you have a refugee family that you're hosting, we can grant between $2,000 to $5,000 for an individual congregation to resettle one family and get the resources they need. And we have larger grants up to $10,000 if you create some sort of system so that you can host multiple families, for example, remodeling a house so that it can be used as a place for families to rotate through. So that's one grant, is resettlement and capacity building. And then the other grant is for empowerment. And that one is modeled after a federal program called Microenterprise Match Grant. And that one is an incentive program for when your refugee family is ready to work, but they don't want to become a dishwasher for their whole lives. It incentivizes them, or it provides matching money for them to be able to level up in their career, like get a college education or buy a car if they want to buy a car. A lot of people ask about how to buy the cars to the refugees. That's the way to do it, is this empowerment grant. The empowerment grant also can be used for things like creating ESL classes. We had one group of churches in New York that did this, creating ESL classes in coordination with the local refugee office. That's empowerment. So basically, one is for resettlement, the other one is for empowerment. So once you've finished getting them resettled and you're ready to help them build their lives in America, then we have a second grant for that. Each of these grants is between $2,000 and $10,000 based on sustainability.
Right, that's the empowerment, the ESL piece is what I want to do. Working with
Okay,
the
great.
local center, and they provide the trainers, we provide the space, the childcare, we work together.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, we just had a group of churches in New York do that, and we were so
All right.
excited to see that one. That was the empowerment one. I'll send it
All
to
right,
you.
then I'll get more details. Thanks.
Cassie, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that sometimes something similar to the empowerment grant is available through your local resettlement agencies.
That's right. That's right. I replicated it based on the federal, the same thing federally. So yes, you can also get the same kind of grants through resettlement agencies. Cassie's absolutely correct. Anyone else? Okay, well, like I said, thanks for bearing through that huge amount of information. Future weeks will be less information heavy and more focused. Again, next week is going to be covering refugees and how to host a refugee population or a refugee family. And we can go more about different types of grants that are eligible for that. And then the third week is going to be about humanitarian parole per Karen's question, since we do have so many folks right now that are on humanitarian parole and why that happened that way. And also a lot of Ukrainians that are coming through the southern border are coming over on humanitarian parole. So what that looks like. That will also cover a couple different populations as well. And then the fourth week, again, is going to be the one that I really encourage you to attend, and that one's going to be asylum, because we need more asylum churches. It's the hardest one, but it's the most necessary right now for what we need to meet the needs of what's happening in forced migration in the United States. So thank you for attending the session, and we will see you next week at 3 p.m. for refugees. Thank you.